Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is Yevamot daf book 100. This is, I guess, day 99 of our learning of Yevamot because there is no daf aleph in the Gemara Bavli, and but this is exciting. We're on daf kuf, and yesterday we concluded by quoting a brisa that detailed 10 categories of people who are not given truma at the granary. Meaning, if a person wants to go to, if the farmer, after farming his field and he has the truma, he wants to go to somebody and give it to them, so he can give it to them. But in addition to that, I am sure, because there were Kohanim did not own property. I mean, they could own property, but they didn't have an inherited property that belonged to them in connection with the distribution of land in Israel. And so as a result, it was likely that they would need to go around and ask for food. And so as a result, you could imagine that a poor Kohen would want to go straight to the source, to the threshing floor in the granary where the wheat was managed and the barley was managed and all the grains were managed, so that they could get their food directly and quickly. And so we said that there were 10 categories of people who didn't get the food at the granary, that they weren't allowed to. And we noted yesterday that all the categories make sense except for women, and we offered two reasons why women should not be given truma at the granary. We're worried about, that she might become divorced and no longer entitled to it, and she'll try and collect it anyway. Or alternatively, we're worried that, she'll be alone with a man in that secluded location. And so, in any event, the brisa concluded by noting that even though we don't give truma at the granary to these 10 people, we may send truma to these people at their home, except for one who is tameh and one who marries a woman whom he's not allowed to marry. And so we're going to begin by analyzing this last part of the brisa, and we're on the 9th line, the last word on the line, v'chulan. V'chulan mishagarin lahem v'vateihem. So we are allowed to send. This is what the brisa is going to quote from the brisa that we ended with yesterday, and the end of that brisa says, and that we can go ahead and send truma to these people, except chutz mitamei the nose isha she'eina hogenislo, except for the person who's tamei and one who marries somebody they're not supposed to. So what does that imply? One of the categories that of somebody who's not allowed to go around to collect the grain was an arel, and somebody who's not circumcised. And and as Rashi noted at the fourth line up from the bottom of the page on Sadik Tetam Abet, we were talking about Kohen Shemeso Achiv Machmas Mila, that we're talking about a Kohen whose brothers died because of the Mila. This is consistent with Rashi throughout Shas, that when we talk about an Arel in this situation, we're talking about an Arel that wasn't able to perform Mila because others in his family had died from that procedure. And so we say that all this implies that you're allowed to go ahead and send truma to somebody who's not circumcised. So my time, what's the reason that you can send it to somebody who's not circumcised? Well, mishum da'anis, it's presumably because he is an ones. He was not responsible for his circumstances. He can't help the fact that his brothers had a condition that resulted in their death, God forbid, from the Mila, and so therefore he's unable to be mal. So Taminami ha'anis. But one second, if that's true, why should we not be allowed to send truma to somebody who is tamei? That also isn't his fault. After all, many circumstances of tuma, just because you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So and we're talking about tumas mace here. So you happen to be in a home where somebody, God forbid, dies, you become tamei lemace. So high nafish onse. So the Gemara answers that there's a difference in a case where the person can't be circumcised. So it's a total ones. It's a total situation where he can't. There's nothing he could do. And so whereas in Baha'i lo nafish onse, but in the case where he's just tamei, there's nothing. There's something that he could do, meaning he could have been even more careful not to be in places where it's even possible for him to becoming tamei. And so as a result, now we've explained that as well. And now we're ready to turn to the next brisa. So the Gemara quotes a brisa that while we do not give a woman truma at the granary, there are things that we do prioritize women. So let's take a look and see where we prioritize women. So Tana Rabbanim, rabbis taught in a brisa, ha'eved ve'isha ein chokin lahem truma beveis hagranos. You don't give to a slave or a woman, you don't give her truma at the granary. Umakom shechokin, and wherever we do distribute to women, and Rashi explains that what does it mean? Hai b'makom shechokin lava truma. That's not referring to truma. It doesn't mean that there are some places where we give women truma at the granary, but rather that it's saying that when there are things that a woman could collect from the granary, like Meiser Ani, where somebody could collect Meiser Ani anywhere, so nosen leisha tchila, then you should give to women first. So there is in fact, sometimes we think that men get all the prioritization in Judaism, but that's not totally true. And so here's this situation where we give to the woman first. Upotrinosa miyad. We let her leave the granary as soon as possible. So my kamar, what is it saying here? What do we mean that what are we talking about? So again, if we just focus on the literal words, it's very confusing. Without my explanation, you wouldn't understand what we're talking about, because we first say that we don't distribute to a woman in the granary, and then we say in a place where we do, we give a woman first and let her leave. Well, what are we talking about? Do we give to a woman in the granary, or do we not give to a woman in the granary? So again, we're now going to explain it exactly as I understood it and explained it first. So Hakikamer, this is what we're talking about. In a place where we give Meiser Ani to women at the granary, well then nosnim leisha tchila. Then we give to a woman first. And my time, what's the reason that we give to the women first? Mishum zilusa, because it's disgraceful for them to have to wait around in a crowd when they're waiting for their tzedakah. And so as a result, we want, especially because of course there are many men there, and so we want to enable the women to get to go back to wherever they need to get, so that they are not in that circumstance, which is, again, not a situation that they want to be in. So Rava, and Rava says that teaching about prioritizing women applies elsewhere. Meresha, at the beginning, kihavu asu gabra beitza ladina kamai, that when a man and a woman would come for for judgment in some kind of litigation in a case in front of me, and so you had a man versus a man and a woman versus a woman in the two cases. So Havasharina Tigra de Gabra Beresha. I used to resolve the man's issue first. Amina de Mechayev mitzvos, because I'd say he's chayev in mitzvos. We want to enable him to get back to his doing of mitzvos, and so as a result, I'll let him go first in the case. Meaning in a case where it's man against man. But Kavan de Shemana Laha, since I heard this ruling about the importance of prioritizing women in a situation where they're waiting around can be a sense of disgrace to them. So Sharina Tigra to Itza Beresha. I ended up doing the women first, the women's cases first. My time of Mishum Zilusa, again, for the same reason, because it would be a disgrace. And so that is the important lesson, that when it comes to prioritizing men versus women, we have to look at the situation, and that sometimes it's going to be more respectful and important for the women to go first, and sometimes that's not the case, and sometimes we want to prioritize the men. Okay, so now we go back to analyzing our Mishnah. So one of the cases, now remember that our Mishnah dealt with a number of cases about children who aren't sure about their parentage. And so one of the cases was a child of a Kohen and his wife gets mixed up with the child of their slave woman. And so we don't know who is who, right? So one is clearly going to be the Kohen, and the other one is the Kohen's slave. So, but we're not sure which is which. So in that case, the Mishnah referenced the possibility of freeing the slaves, and then they would both be able to get married. Because of course, at the moment, when we have this person who may be a Kohen or may be a slave, there is no category of person whom this person could marry. They can't marry a regular Jew because of the slave. They can't marry a slave because of the Kohen. They're stuck. There's nothing that they could do. So now we're going to analyze that case and understand the degree to which the freedom that we talk about their becoming freed is voluntary or mandatory. So let's take a look. So Higdilu Hatarobos. We said that the two young children, they grow up. And now what happens if they happen to free each other? We say Shichru. They're right. They freed each other. So that and then we're going to and then the Mishnah continued with what happens in that situation. Well, what's the implication? The implication is iboyin, ilo boy lo. That if they want to free each other, they can. But if they don't want to free each other, they don't have to. We're not going to force them to. But why is this something that should be considered voluntary? Lisa Shifcha Eno Yachol, the guy, they're not able to marry a slave, and and they're not able to marry a free woman, because again, they can't marry the slave because he could be a free person, and they can't marry a free woman, because he might be a slave. So Amarava, Ema Kofano San, Umashach Rurin Zetzep. No, in fact, we should say that this Mishnah is telling us that, in fact, we do compel them to free each other. That because we have this concept that we saw this concept actually at the beginning of Maseches Chagiga, where we learned about this machlokus between Shammai and Hillel, where Hillel ends up agreeing with Beis Shammai that in fact we do require the person to free a half-freed slave to be fully freed, because a half-free person is not able to marry anybody. So now so we've now confirmed that fact, that we're going to require them to free one another. And now we go to a later part of our Mishnah, which the end of the Mishnah, which said Nosnim Aleim Chumrei Kohanim Chumrei Yisraelim. That we said that the stringencies of both being a Kohen and being a Yisrael would apply to these two people. And so the Gemara asks, so Lamai Hilchasa, what are we talking about here? The rest of our Mishnah detailed a whole bunch of laws that were going to be strict. So what is this referencing? So Amara Papa Leminchasam. It's talking about their mincha offering. There's a korban, a sacrifice, an offering in the Beit HaMikdash that involves what is called a mincha offering, and that is a grain-based offering in which the Kohen would take some of the grain and put it on the fire, and then if the offerer was a Yisrael, So then the rest of the grain that was left over would be for the Kohen to eat. But if the Kohen offers a mincha offering, all of the entire mincha offering gets burned. And if a non-Kohen offers it, so then the process is that the Kohen would take his 3 middle fingers and scoop up and use the fingers on either side to wipe away any extra, and whatever was stuck in his hand in the 3 fingers would end up being burned, and that would be the offering of the Yisrael's mincha offering. But of course, there would be more grain that would be left over, and that additional grain that would be left over would be that additional dough that would be left over would be for the Kohen to eat. And so as a result, that is, but on the other hand, again, when a Kohen brought this offering, there was no kamitza, and it was just totally burned. It just all went on the altar. So now in our case, we have somebody who maybe is a Kohen and maybe he's not a Kohen. But what do we do? So that's the situation that we're talking about, that we apply the strictures of both. So what do we have to do? So nikmetzes keminchas Yisrael, we end up doing the kamitza, taking the 3 fingers worth, just like a Yisrael's mincha offering involves taking the 3 fingers. The eina ne'achaz keminchas kohanim, but what's left over does not get eaten because it is a mincha potentially a mincha of a kohen. So haketza. So what do you do with it, with the stuff that's left over? So al kometz karev ba'atzma. So the stuff that you grab in the 3 fingers, that gets offered on the altar. V'hashirayim krivin ba'atzman, and the rest then get offered separately. Well, 1 second, there's a problem with that approach of burning the second part of what's left over, because ikurei kan kol shemimenu leishim harehu beval taktiru, because we have a principle that says that anything that you put on the fire, whatever's left doesn't get burned. Well, 1 second, we just said that you take the first scoop, the kamitza, and you burn that, and then you're going to burn the rest in a separate, also on the altar. But that won't work, because anything after you do any first burning, you can't do any remaining burning. So Gemara now answers, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Brei de Rabbi Yishimon ben Pazi, Demasik Lahu Lashum Eitzim. So you don't burn it as an offering, you burn it as if it were firewood that you put on the altar. And Rabbi Eliezer, and it's like Rabbi Eliezer says, because there's the Rabbi Eliezer here, it gets changed to Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer says the Tanya, because we have a brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer l'reach nichoach iatamala, avatamala l'shum eitzim, that when it says that you're not allowed to burn the leftovers of the mincha offering, that's only to burn it as a reach nichoach, as an aroma for God, namely with sacrificial intent. But if you want to just burn it on the altar as if it were wood, well, that you would be allowed to do. But Hanichel Rabbi Eliezer, that all works according to Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer says that you can burn it that way, but the Rabbanan disagree with him and say that you can't burn it at all, that there's no way to burn it on the altar. So what are they going to say? So the Avila Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon. So they say that you should do like what Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon says. Now, Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon talked about this in a different context, and we'll talk about it in a moment. So what did he say? The Tanya, he taught in a brisa that when it comes to there are certain times where somebody who commits a sin needs to offer a mincha offering, and so this mincha offering, this is specifically for certain sins where there is what's known as a korban ola v'yored, where there are different categories of level of giving an offering. If you're particularly poor, you offer the mincha offering. If you're a little bit more wealthy, you offer the birds, 2 birds. If you're a little more wealthy than that, then you bring the regular ewe or a female goat as a sin offering. And so in those sins, this is for, if you falsely deny knowledge of testimony under oath, if you enter the Beit HaMikdash or eat some kodshim while you're tameh, if you make other kinds of false oaths. So these kinds of sins, those 3 categories, offer a korban olah v'yored. And so this person, so now we have the Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon is talking about a Kohen who makes this kind of offering. And so he's going to tell us what happens to that Kohen's offering. So let's see. So Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon Omer, HaKomich Karav La'atzmo, he says that the Komich is offered by itself, V'ashirayim Mispazrin Al Beis HaDeshen, and the rest is scattered on the ash heap. So right next to the altar was an ash heap where they would put initially all the ashes from that got burned on the altar, and then every day in the morning they would move that outside the Beit HaMikdash, and that would be the Trumas Hadeshen that would be done in the beginning of the day. And so that's what you would do. So you wouldn't actually burn it, but you put it on the ash heap itself. Rabbanan lo pligi aled Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. And although in that brisa talking about when a Kohen who has to bring a sinner's mincha, there's a differing opinion with respect to the sinner's mincha. When it comes to that is the only place where the rabbis would disagree with Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon. That's where they disagree. But devas hakravahu, because they felt that it should be offered on the altar in its total, meaning that the whole thing should just go on the altar. Aval hacha, here in the case where we got somebody who might be a Kohen or might not be a Kohen, well then afilu rabbanan modu, even the rabbis would agree that Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon's solution would be a good solution, meaning you can't burn the leftovers because there's a prohibition against burning the leftovers, and you can't just let the leftover, and you can't just bring the whole thing because you need to treat it differently from the komets, from the initial group, because maybe the person is a Yisrael. So the answer is, according to this view, would be that you take the first little bit, the 3 fingers worth, you put that on the altar, and the rest can't be eaten, but rather gets put on the ash heap so that it doesn't get eaten. Okay, so and again, that's the second view. The first view is that you burn it as if it were firewood. So those are the 2 different views with respect to how we deal with the mincha offering of this person who might be a Kohen and might not be a Kohen. So we're continuing now with the next Mishnah, and we're continuing with a discussion of people who are in an uncertain situation. And so we're going to deal with 4 different situations, and you can see on the screen that there are different rules for each situation. So we'll take a look and see. So Mishalo Haisa Acher Shahasa, Mishalo Hasa Acher Bala Shlosha Kadashim. If a woman did not wait, Lo Shasa, she didn't wait after her first husband, the required 3 months. We saw earlier in Yevamot the requirement to avoid uncertainty about who the dad is, that you want to wait 3 months after the separation from the husband, from the first husband, before getting married to the second husband. And now Venisus Vialda, and now she married somebody else and she gave birth. And so Ve'en Yadua im ben Tisha Rishon im ben Shiva La'achron, we don't know whether the child that has been now conceived and born is a 9-month child for the first husband or a 7-month child for the second husband. So we don't know who's the dad. So Hayula banim mina rishonu banim mina sheni. Now what happens? We'll deal with the first case where she has other sons from the first husband and other sons from the second husband. So Cholzin v'lo miyavmin. in that situation, the other sons perform chalitza. So if this son, who we're not sure whether he was the son of husband number one or husband number two, if he dies without children, well, now nobody is going to be able to do yibum with him, because the children of the first husband and the mom can't do yibum with him, because maybe they're not actually the brother from the father, and so as a result they can't do yibum, and then similarly the children of husband number two and the mom also can't do yibum, because maybe the son who died is actually the son of husband number one, and so they're not the same father, so they can't do yibum. Now, not only that, but even if one were to do chalitza, the other group can't do yibum or can't still marry the person, because you're not allowed to marry the wife of your brother, even if that is a half brother from a mother. So we've seen before that that the only exception to marrying the wife of your brother is yibum, and so as a result, if this is not a yibum case, the brothers that are surviving will not be allowed to marry the deceased brother's or half brother in this case, the deceased half brother's wife. They're not going to be allowed to marry her, and so as a result, they have to do chalitza. They're not able to do yibum. And now, v'chein hu lahem. And similarly, if any of these other brothers die without children, he can't do yibum for them. Rather, choletz v'lo me'abim. He has to do chalitza. He can't do yibum. And now we turn to Kuf Amud Bet, and we say, hayu lo achem min harishon v'achem min hasheni shelo me'osa ha'en. So now we have a different situation. Now we have this man who were, again, the mom married husband number one. After that relationship ended, we'll talk about how that relationship ended shortly, and now married husband number two, and we now have this child. So this child, we'll call him uncertainty. So uncertainty, we don't know whether uncertainty is the son of husband number one or husband number two. Now, in that situation, now we're going to have husband number one was also married to another woman and had other sons, and husband number two, and let's say, just assume for the moment that there was one other son. We'll call him a husband number one junior, and there was one son from husband number two. We'll call him husband number two junior. And so now husband number one junior or now this uncertainty dies without children. So now what happens? So who choletzu miyabim? So I'm sorry. So we'll do the case in the Mishnah is that junior husband number one junior dies, or husband number two junior dies, and they die without children, and now they leave a widow. So as a result, there is no other sibling. So the only possible person to marry the widow is uncertainty, and uncertainty, he can do either chalitza or yibum. Now, why, you might ask, is that? Well, let's work it through. Of course he can do chalitza, because worst comes to worst, it's nothing. It's okay for him to do chalitza even when it's not required. But maybe he's actually the half brother from the father of the deceased, and so as a result, he should do chalitza. But he can also do yibum, because there are two possibilities. One possibility is that he shares the father with the deceased husband. But the other possibility is that he doesn't share any parents with the deceased husband, because he's the son of husband number one, of the other husband and the woman. And that woman didn't have any other children. And so as a result, either he's the half brother from the father, or he's not related. Well, that means that either he could do yibum or there's no yibum that applies whatsoever, and he can marry the woman. So as a result, we allow him to do either chalitza or yibum in that situation. And similarly for him. Now, if it's a little more complicated in this situation, but now uncertainty dies. Uncertainty dies, and he's left with husband number one, junior, and husband number two, junior, as potential people to do yibum with his wife. And so, what happens if that situation? So echad choletz the echad miyabim. One first does chalitza, and then the other one can do yibum. And why is that? Because if in fact the right one did chalitza, well then the yibum that is happening is actually the marriage of two unrelated people. But if the chalitza was not with the right one, well then the person who's doing yibum was in fact the deceased uncertainties half brother from the father, and so as a result he can do yibum. So either way that it works out, as long as the first one does chalitza and the second one does yibum, we'll be fine. We'll see that more in the Gemara. So now case number 3. So what happens is, if again the situation is the child is born after 7 months after the second husband and 9 months after the first husband. Well, what happens is Haya Echad Yisrael ve'Echad Kohen. If one of the parents, one of the fathers, husband number 1, let's say, was a Yisrael, and husband number 2 was a Kohen. So Nosa Isha Ru'uya Kohen. Then the son, there's going to be a bunch of requirements. One requirement is that the son needs to marry a woman that is fit for a Kohen, because maybe he's a Kohen. And because he may be a Kohen, he's not allowed to become tummy to a dead person. However, if he does become contaminated, if he does purposefully become tummy to somebody, he would not get the lashes that a Kohen would get, because maybe he's not a Kohen. He's not allowed to eat truma, but if he does eat truma, he doesn't pay the penalty for eating truma, the penalty of an additional fifth, or even the principal, because maybe he's not a Kohen. And he does not receive a portion at the granary, again, as we saw, because maybe he's not a Kohen. However, if he has his own truma, he can sell. He can sell the truma because maybe it belongs to him. He does not get a portion of the consecrated items in the Beit HaMikdash. And we don't give him kochim to offer. However, when he has certain kochim himself, we're not going to take it away from him, because again, maybe he's a Kohen. Now he is exempt when there are certain parts of an animal that are given to a Kohen, and he's exempt from having to do that because maybe he's a Kohen. When it comes to his firstborn, because he should just leave it to graze until it becomes blemished, and then he doesn't have to worry about it, because maybe he's the Kohen. And we impose upon him the stringencies of the Kohanim and the stringencies of the Israelim. Now, what happens if both the husbands were Kohanim? So who onin aleihem? Well, then this young man, this uncertainty, would have to observe the laws of aninut, namely that he does not eat kodshim because he, on the day of the death of one of these men who may be his dad, the Haimon and Ninalav. And similarly, they have, if uncertainty dies first, well then his two potential fathers will need to observe the laws of aninut for him, because maybe he's the relative. So on the day that he dies, they would have to withhold themselves, refrain from eating any kind of sacrificial meat. So who eino mitame lahem? On the other hand, he is not allowed to become tummy for them, because maybe the person is not in fact his father. the haim einan mitamin lo, and they don't become contaminated for him because maybe he is not their son. So who eino yorish otan? He doesn't get to inherit from them because the other siblings will say, you have to prove that our father is your father, and you can't do that. Avalhem yoshanoto, but they can inherit him because of the concept that if there are two people in a similar situation of uncertainty, you can split it. So the two fathers would split the inheritance of this son. Upater al makato, al kulato, shelzev the shelzev. And if he strikes or curses one of those potential fathers, he's not going to be liable because we don't know whether in fact he is their son. Ola b'mishmaro shelzev v'shelzev. He goes up to the Beit HaMikdash and can work in the mishmar of either one of the fathers, because whichever one is a Kohen, he's allowed to go and work with them. But he doesn't get a share of the meat, because although he can take on the obligations of doing the work, we're not going to give him the benefits, because the other Kohanim who work on that same shift can say, how do we know that this is really your shift? You need to prove that it's your shift. However, if the two potential fathers happen to be both a part of the same shift that works in the Beis HaMikdash, well then that son, that the uncertainty is in a lucky situation, and no tochelik echad. He'd be allowed to take his share, because he either gets a share from father number one, or he gets a share from husband number two. So as a result, he'd be able to get something. All right. So now that was all pretty complicated, and now we get into a little bit more detail about this. So Davka Michlatz Tahadar Yebume. When we talked about the case of the brothers having the husband number one and husband number two being potentially the father, but but husband number one junior and husband number two junior do not share the mother with uncertainty. In that situation, we said that if uncertainty dies, then husband number one junior or husband number two junior, one of them should do chalitza, and then the other one could do yibum. And the Gemara now tells us that it specifically has to happen in that order. First, the chalitza has to happen, and then the yibum. About yibum lo, you can't allow them to do the yibum first, because the kapaga be Yevamot l'shuk, because there's a 50-50 chance that the person who ends up doing yibum first is actually not the relative. And so as a result, that if the non-relative were to marry the woman, that would be Yevamot l'shuk. That would be like sending out the widow to the marketplace, and she's not allowed to marry someone from the marketplace until after chalitza or yibum. And so as a result, we need to first have one brother do yibum, one potential brother do yibum, and the other then can do, one potential brother do chalitza, and then afterwards, the other brother could then do, or the other potential brother, I should say, could do yibum. Okay, so that is, we were just, as I mentioned during the Mishnah, that was the explanation that I gave during the Mishnah, and now the Gemara just clarifies that it's specifically in that order that we need to do this. So now we're going to deal with a new case of what happens in the following situation. Amar Shmuel Asara Kohanim Omdim. You got 10 Kohanim standing around. Uvperish Echad Mehem Uval. And now one of them goes and has relations with an unmarried woman, and we don't know which Kohen did so. Havlad Shtuki. The child is called a Shtuki. Shtuki comes from the word shtika, quiet or silence, and so as a result, we're meaning that we don't talk about his ancestry. So my shtuki, but in what sense do we not talk about this child's ancestry? In what sense do we say that effectively he's stuck? If you want to say that we're going to silence him from not getting inheritance from his father's inheritance, well, pshita, that's pretty obvious, because miyad inan abu amanu, do we know who the father is? We don't know. So elamish shemishatkin oso midin kahuna. Rather, we say that he's not even allowed, even though we know that the father is a Kohen. Shmuel is telling us that in this situation, we don't allow him to act like a Kohen. Well, 1 second. My timer. What's the reason? So Amar Kra, we cite a pasuk, the pasuk that's in Sefer Bamidbar. It's Bamidbar Parakab Hey pasuk Yud Gimel. V'haizo lo uzaro acharav. That when it talks about a Kohen, it's for his offspring acharav, after him. So what does that imply? Be'inan zaro miyuchas acharav. We need to know who the father is. If you don't know who the father is, then it's going to be a problem. We're not going to treat the person as a Kohen, Veleka. And in this case, we don't know who the father is. Well, now, of course, we're going to ask eventually from our Mishnah. But before we get to our Mishnah, Maskif lo Rav Papa, Elamiata Gabi Avraham. 1 second. What about when God told Abraham, Diksiv liot l'cha le'elokim ulazar acha acharecha, that it should be, that God was going to be a God for you and your offspring after you. Well, what's the Hasamai Kamazahir Le Rahmana? What's the Torah telling Abraham there in saying after you? So Hakik Kamar Lai, this is what God was telling him. Lo Tinsab Obedis Kochavim B'Shifka. Don't marry somebody who is worships idols or somebody who is a slave. The Lo Lezil Zaracha Basra, because you shouldn't have your offspring follow her status. And so as a result, that's what the Torah was trying to tell us. Now, of course, all the commentaries say, well, 1 second, what about Abraham marrying Hagar, who was a slave? So the easiest answer is that Abraham freed Hagar before marrying her. So that's the easiest answer in that circumstance. But in any event, so now that we've addressed the pasuk in the Torah, but Meisvei, what about the following brisa? And then eventually, again, we'll ask the third question, which will be from our Mishnah. So Rishon Ro Elios Kohen Gadol. We said with respect to the case that a Yavam married a Yevamot and failed to wait 3 months. We dealt with this. This was a while ago. This was back on Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph that we talked about this in more detail. But where you have a woman and the husband number one dies. Now she's supposed to wait 3 months before doing Yibum, but she ended up doing Yibum too soon. And of course the first husband was a Kohen and the second husband's a Kohen. And now we say that even in that situation where there's an uncertainty, Rishon Roy Liot Kohen Gadol, this child that they have is fit to become the Kohen Gadol. But 1 second, don't we need the Kohen to have a sufficient certainty associated with his parentage? Vileka, and that certainty is lacking here. So Zaro Miyuchas Acharab Dirabanan. Really, when we said Ukra Asmachta Ba'alma, that when we quoted the pasuk earlier, it was just a scriptural support for a rabbinic decree, and really this is only a rabbinic decree that says that a Kohen's offspring needs to be certain about his parentage in order to be able to serve as a Kohen. And where was it that the rabbis made this decree that said that when you have a Kohen with uncertain parentage, he's no longer able to be a Kohen? Biznus. That's where there was a non-marital relations that happened. But if there was benisuin, but if there was a full marriage, lo gazer rabbanan. And here in the case of the yibum that happened too fast, there was a full-fledged marriage. And so everything was totally on the up and up. And so as a result, the rabbis did not make a decree in that situation. Well, 1 second. Uviznus mi gazer rabbanan. Is it really true that when it came to a non-marital relation, the rabbis made a decree? Well, what about our Mishnah? The Hatzanan, Mishalo Shahasa achar bala shlosha chadashim, that if a woman didn't wait 3 months after separating from her first husband, v'nisis v'yalda, and now she married somebody else and gave birth. And what did we say at the end of Mishnah? That if we were talking about two kohanim, where there were two kohanim, we allow the person to work in the mishmar. So now let's see, what is the case that we're talking about? So my achar bala, what does it mean after separating from the first husband? So ilema achar misas bala, if you say that we're talking about after the death of the first husband, and we're going to offer now 5 different explanations of what we mean, and that with that we'll be finished for the day. So first explanation is husband number 1 died. Well, that can't be, because if you say ema seifa, what about the end of our Mishnah? Hu onein aleihem v'hem onein alav, that both of the fathers need to observe the laws of aninut, that they don't eat from a korban on the day that their potential son died. The first husband is dead already. So bishlam hu onein aleihem. It makes sense for the son to be an onein on either of the fathers. But mishkachas labenisuin, because we got the second husband. V'likut atzamot tekama, or maybe you're gathering the bones of the first husband, which also triggers aninut. There's a rule that if you move a deceased body, the day of that moving of the deceased from one grave to another is also a day of aninut, a day of being an onein, a day of saying that for a kohen not eating any of the sacrifices. But how can you find a situation where husband number 1 is going to be an onein for him? Kamaha misle, the first husband already died, so there's nothing, he can't ever be an onein because he's dead. So ella begrusha. All right, so let's say that the first husband divorced the wife. So umay achar bala. Well, and then what does it mean after her husband? Achar get bala. It means after the husband gave her a divorce. Well, 1 second, that still doesn't work, because ema seifa in the latter part of the Mishnah, hu ein mitame lahem, v'hein ein mitame lo. He doesn't contaminate himself for them, and they don't contaminate themselves for him. Well, bishlam hein ein mitame lo. Now it makes sense that he can't become tamei, that they can't become tamei for him, l'chumra, because that's we have to be machmer, the kol chad b'chad dimul lav brehu, because each one of them may not be his father, that he might not be their son. But Elohu, emetamin lahai lahem amai. But with respect to him, why can't he become tamei for them? So bishlam l'sheni loli tamei. When it comes to the second husband, he can't be a tummy for the son, can't be tummy for him, because maybe he's the son of the first husband. But Elo Larishon, but when it comes with respect to becoming tummy for the first husband, li tummy lay mimanavshach, he should no matter what be able to become tummy, because Ibrehu, if in fact he's the son of the first husband, well then shaper kamitami lay, he's allowed to become tummy to him, because a kohen is allowed to become tummy to his father. The Ibar Basrahu, but if he's the son, and even if he's the son of the second husband, Shaper Kamatamile, he can still become Tame to the first husband, because the second husband married a divorcee, and the son of a divorcee, Dechalolhu, is considered a chalal. A chalal is a kohen who is born out of a marital relationship that it was prohibited for his father, the kohen, or the son of a chalal. And as a result, he's not subject to being a kohen. He doesn't have the same kohen restrictions, so he can become tamei. So as a result, we cannot say that our case in our Mishnah is talking about a situation of divorce. So elalav biznus, right? And we must be talking about a situation where the first husband, in air quotes, is not in fact married to the woman. Umay achar bala, and when it says after her first husband, it doesn't mean after a husband, rather it means achar boala, after he has marital relations with her. The Ketani Seifa, and yet in the end of our Mishnah, it says, Ola b'mishmar shel zeh v'shel zeh, he can go work with either one of the sacrifice, with either one of the units, either one of the watches, that either one of the Kohen groups that work in the Beit Hamikdash. The Kohanim were broken up into 24 groups, and he can work with either the group that husband number one was in, or the one that husband was number two. So Utsiyuv to Shmuel. So all of this should be a refutation, should disprove Shmuel, because Shmuel said that when you're uncertain about the parentage and we're talking about a situation without marriage, then the Kohen is no longer a Kohen. He doesn't get to act like a Kohen. The son doesn't get to act like a Kohen. So Amar Rav Shmaya, where Shmaya says, nah, so 1 second, we can say there's another category that we could say our Mishnah is talking about. The Mama'enet, with a woman who was an orphan. Her father died, and her brothers and mother marry her off while she is a minor. In that situation, she has the right, until she grows up and becomes an adult, she has the right to cancel that first marriage. And so maybe we're talking about a situation like that. Well, the problem with that is, is it possible for her to have a child? A child, when she's able to be mama'enet, when she's able to undo the marriage, she will be she's still a minor. But Tani Rav Bivi Kamedu Rav Nachman, and Rav Bivi taught the following brisa in front of Rav Nachman: Shalosh Noshim Mishamshos B'moch. There are 3 women who are allowed to use contraception. Contraception. Katana, Muberes, Umenika. Somebody who's a minor, somebody who's pregnant, and somebody who's nursing. So Katana, Shema Tisaber Besamos. Well, minor, because we're worried that she'll become pregnant and die. Muberet, a pregnant woman, because Shema Tasa Ubara Sanda, we're worried that the fetus inside her will become miscarried. Menika, and a nursing woman, Shema Tigmal Espinava Yamos, maybe she'll stop having to milk her, she'll stop producing milk, and her child will be forced to wean, and he may die as a result of not getting proper nourishment. So ve'ezehi katana, and so who's considered a katana? Mibas achahasrei shana v'yom echad, someone who's 11 and a day, ad bas shtemasrei shana v'yom echad, until the age of 12, because pachos mikan o yeser alkein mishameshes kedarka v'holechas. Anybody who's younger than that or older can just have regular marital relations. Divrei Rebbe Meir. The Chachamim omrim achazo v'achazo mishameshes kedarka v'holechas. Right? The Chachamim say no. Whatever the age is, all of these women should just have regular marital relations. Umin hashamayim yirachamei yirachemu, and they should be. Hashem should have mercy on them. Shnei shomer b'soyim Hashem. Hashem protects those who are simple. And in any event, but the bottom line is we see from this brisa that a girl under the age of 11 can't become pregnant, and between the ages of 11 and 12, she can't survive the pregnancy. So as a result, that shows that that this woman can't have a child, and so as a result, and still be able to refuse her husband. And so as a result, if that can't be the situation, so finally we come to the last of the possibilities. We're talking about a situation where the first marriage, husband number one, was a mistaken betrothal, that there was a condition to the marriage. And it was like Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel Mishum Rabbi Yishmael V'hi lo nispasa, that when it comes to a case where we're worried about adultery, we say that she cannot have been forced. That's when a woman is prohibited to be with her husband. And only when she was not forced, asurat, then she's forbidden to stay with her husband. Hanispasa, but if she was forced, muteres, and then she's allowed to remain with her husband. The yesh lecha acheres, and in addition, there's another situation that when it says he lonis pasa, that tells us that there's another situation that is also permitted. She'af al pi shalonis pasa muteris, that even though she was not forced, she's allowed to stay with her husband. The ezozo, and what's that talking about? Shekidusha kedushe tos, a woman who had a mistaken engagement, a mistaken kedushin. Shafilu b'na murkav la aksefa, that even though her son is riding on her shoulders, mima enes v'holechas la, she can say because the entire marriage was based on a mistake in condition. So as a result, she's allowed to walk away without any get. And that explains why the second husband, who's a Kohen, is allowed to marry her, because she's not a divorcee. And even though she has children, she's not she's not considered a woman to whom a Kohen's not allowed to marry. And so now we've explained how the situation can be, right? Husband number one had a mistaken marriage with her, and it did not require a divorce. So as a result, there was no non-marital relations. So the son can serve as a Kohen, because the rabbi's decree of where you don't know your parentage only applies where the marital relation, where the relationship, where the sexual relationship is not is not a legal one, does not involve a husband and wife. And here, even though eventually we end up saying that the marriage was a mistake and she's allowed to go away from her husband even without a get, we say that that in that situation, that is not considered a non-marital relationship. And so as a result, the child is still permitted to do the Kohen service, even though he doesn't know who his father is. And so now we've clarified that our Mishnah, like the case of Yibum, where the Yibum happens and the brother who's a Kohen does Yibum too soon, and we said that the son, even though he doesn't know who his father is allowed to become even the Kohen Gadol. Here too, this man doesn't know who his father is, but he's allowed to serve as a Kohen because both of the potential fathers had legal relations with his mother. And so as a result, whichever one is his father, he doesn't need to worry about the fact that there was improper marital relations. And so therefore he can serve as a Kohen. Whereas in a situation where the rabbis made their decree, when there was no marital relationship, where it was a non-marital relationship, and therefore they said that in the non-marital relationship we're going to require that the Kohen not serve as a Kohen because he needs to know his parentage. And so tomorrow we're going to finish up the 11th chapter, and we're going to begin the 12th chapter, which details the chalitza process. So exactly what happens, in front of whom, what the steps are, and a very interesting process. A very Baruch, thank God, relatively rarely seen process, but unfortunately there are occasions where it is required. May God protect us and ensure that those occasions are as few and rare as possible.
Thank you, Rabbi. See you
Have
tomorrow.
a wonderful day. See you tomorrow.
Yes, sir.